Welcome to Our Country, Our Choice. This is Mike Sparazza. I have the special honor of being here today with CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Colonel, how are you?
Excellent.
I'm glad to hear that. You've taken a position in a brand new movement, Colonel, in Our Country, Our Choice. For those listening out there, what is Our Country, Our Choice?
Well, that's an important question. Keep in mind that Our Country, Our Choice is a group founded by people who are determined to unite as many Americans as possible across party lines. Collectively, I would say we're very frustrated with the constant absence of any unity, except when it comes to spending and war. We would like to see unanimity on a number of issues. We think that there are a lot of Republicans and Democrats that share a commonality in values. So we're looking at groups of people who share traditional, mostly conservative American values, and they're very interested in restoring the republic. And by that, I mean looking at the issues that hold us together as a nation, the things that bring us together, the things that unite us. We'll talk about some of those things in a minute. And then finally, we want to be action-oriented. We want to set up in every state and every district, if we can, so that we can press ahead with the key issues on our agenda and actually hold people accountable, compel people who are holding office to do what they said they would do, and also identifying people that haven't and making that clear to American citizens. We think that American citizenship is perhaps the most important thing of all at stake right now. Americans have not taken their duties as citizens as seriously as they need to. That needs to end. We need to value our citizenship as well as its obligations and duties. So the bottom line is, I think this is something that a lot of your listeners would be interested in joining. And it's an opportunity for them to have a real impact. Because one of the things that we hear over and over and over again is, how do I, as an individual, change anything? Okay, I don't like the fact that we have open-ended conflicts overseas. I don't want our troops in 16 different countries at any given point in time. I don't want to pay taxes that fund medical procedures, transgender operations, woke agendas, values that are antithetical to us. How do I do something? Well, we're setting up a series of tools, both for information, also for your input, that will enable you to directly influence these issues on a nationwide basis. And we're welcoming as much as possible other organizations that already exist who share our values, and we want to give them a platform. And then I hope, lastly, we will become a source of what I would call fact-based information. In other words, if we put out a news item, it's not going to be opinionated. It's not going to be shaded by a particular point of view. We want the facts. That's something we used to get from the news media. We don't get it anymore. We want to also try to fill that void. So that's a thumbnail sketch, but I think it's as much as we can say at this point. And we have a lot of things to cover, so I'll cut it off at that point.
Yeah, I think you said a couple things there. Unity, leadership, and love for country are things that we need in America right now. And those are three definitely big things. Before we continue, though, on OCOC, I want to ask you about your opinion on what's going on in the Middle East right now. Obviously, some sad things going on in Israel and in Palestine right now. Colonel, you've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. You've spent time at the highest levels of our military. How do you see this playing out?
I suppose that's the question that's on everyone's mind. What I would say to begin with is this is a far, far more dangerous situation than most Americans realize. Keep in mind that with each passing day, passing week, and month, the situation in Ukraine grows more and more dangerous simply because the probability of a U.S.-led NATO confrontation with Russia continues to exist. As long as that's a possibility, we are at risk in the United States and in Europe. Now we have a situation in the Middle East that is much less predictable and far more volatile. You also have an Israeli population that is enraged and shocked by the excesses of these Hamas fighters and the horrible acts that they committed. So emotions are running very, very high. And the Israelis obviously want blood. They want revenge. They want to exact a price for what's happened. And I don't know what the current count is, how many Israelis have been killed, but certainly as many as there were Hamas fighters, and that was roughly 1,500, probably more. And we don't know how many exactly have been injured. But as long as emotions are running high, that means that reason is at a minimum. And the Israelis have to understand that this is a particular event that, if it's not handled carefully, could become the rallying cry for a region-wide attack on Israel. And that is not, by any stretch of the imagination, impossible right now. For instance, the Egyptians, and allegedly an Egyptian general officer on the general staff, actually informed the Israeli general staff and its intelligence operatives that there was an attack coming from Hamas. That's alleged. But I think that's probably true, and I think it reflects the fact that Egypt really wants to maintain the peace with Israel. However, Egypt is under a lot of pressure, as are all the Arab states right now, to respond to their populations who are horrified. And their populations want humanitarian aid delivered to the 2 million people in Gaza. Well, this is a problem for the Israelis because obviously they want to isolate Gaza. They've already turned off the water and the electricity. They're trying to squeeze the population on the assumption that that will help them get control of whatever remains of Hamas. Well, that's open to debate, but that's very dangerous because the Egyptians, if they come to the border with Gaza with an aid convoy, which is their plan right now, the Israelis have said, we will take you under fire. That would be a serious mistake because Egypt wants to avoid a war. But if the Israelis should fire on the Egyptians in this aid convoy, it would be very difficult for the president of Egypt and his government not to take action against the Israelis. The moment that such an event occurs, I would expect the president of Turkey, along with a number of other regional actors, to immediately offer assistance to Egypt. That's the ingredient of a regional war. And we can do many things, but we don't right now have the ground forces in any substantial numbers to make a difference. The Israelis are fielding an army right now inside Israel of about 470,000 troops. This is with their fully mobilized reserves. That's a force larger than the United States Army. So the point is, what can we do? Well, we can do what we've done. We can certainly send aircraft carrier battle groups there, but they're limited in what they can influence ashore. And then they also become targets potentially if they join into the fight. And then secondly, we can urge the Israelis, despite the obvious disgraceful conduct of the opponent, to exercise some measure of restraint as they press into Gaza. But it's hard to control that. And if they do go into Gaza, by the way, could end up being a casualty factory for the Israeli Defense Force. These are reservists. These are not professional soldiers. They have no recent experience operating in that kind of urban terrain. 140 square miles with 2 million people in it is a nightmare. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. So it's a dangerous situation. We shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yeah, it's a scary time, and obviously pray for all those innocent people over there. That's all I can say. Pray for those people and pray for their safety over the next few weeks to months to years, maybe. We will not know until it ends up finishing itself out. Let's go back to OCOC for a minute, Colonel. What are the most important issues for OCOC? I know, and I keep saying OCOC, our country, our choice. What are the most important issues? You touched on them a little bit before, but let's dive deeper into those issues.
Well, I think perhaps the first one we should talk about is this issue of election integrity. And you and I know that the Republicans and the Democrats for years have struggled with this, depending upon which election it was. We can go all the way back to 1960 to the election of President John F. Kennedy, which in retrospect was probably stolen, given the numbers of organized crime figures and corrupt politicians in the major cities in the United States who essentially stole votes or threw votes away that were not for Kennedy. Nixon wanted to oppose it, but he decided to let it go for reasons of national security and because he also trusted John F. Kennedy. Right now, we're in a very different position because we've discovered even more corruption than existed then. It's only metastasized and gotten worse. So the question is, what can we do about it? And what we are doing is setting up groups of people inside OCOC to deal with this. And we have to look at it ultimately on a state-by-state level, because, as I'm sure you're aware, the Constitution, whether we like it or not, gives the states the authority to run the elections. We don't even have federal standards for elections for federal federal positions. That's unheard of in the advanced world. Virtually everyone has to have the same standards in order for elections to be taken seriously. But we can try and work on that. There's some things that we can do. Obviously, voter ID is one of them. And that is still not sorted out at the state level. There are places where if you show up and you get a driver's license, then they register you to vote. You may not be a citizen. You may be from any number of different places. That's obviously unacceptable. There are ways to do this, and I think we'll come up with more ways in the future, but certainly everything from passports to birth certificates to government IDs that have to be matched to legitimate legal residencies in the area where people are voting. We think Election Day should be a public holiday. Well, why not? Just because it says the first Tuesday in November, we could change that if we really wanted to. Obviously, again, that's in the Constitution, but it can be done. We really think in-person voting is appropriate. This goes back to the issue of citizenship. You know, if you are too busy as a citizen of the United States to show up and cast your vote, there's something radically wrong. We only provided absentee ballots because of our experience during the Civil War. We had 1 million men in the field, and they needed to vote in the election of 1864. And so we said absentee ballots for people serving in the armed forces. Now we have a whole range of different qualifications that justify an absentee ballot. We think that has to be re-examined. It's too easy and it's wrong. And we can't trust these voting machines. There are big problems with them. We saw it in the past. So that's, again, why we think paper ballots are important. And finally, you know, there has to be supervision that is bipartisan or neutral. You know, in most countries in the world, you have representatives of the various parties present at the voting booth, and they both review the identity of the person who wants to vote. They have to agree that this person is who or what she says she is, and then they're allowed to do it. We need a similar system. We also need some penalties for cheating, including some mandatory jail time. Right now, you can lie, cheat, or steal on election day, and there's no real penalty for it. This is unacceptable. Now, this is a thumbnail sketch. There's a lot more that we could cover, but that's where we're starting. And we have a lot of interest in OCOC, and we welcome more people, Democrats and Republicans, who care about this issue to come on board, because it's in everyone's interest. The notion that it is not is just fundamentally wrong.
Now, Colonel, I know I always say this. A nation can't be a real nation without fair and unbiased elections and without secure borders. And I know that's another talking point of OCOC. How does our country, our choice, feel that we can secure our borders? Or how do we get people to care about securing our borders? Because it feels like some people do, other people don't. They have their reasons, but how do we make sure that we secure our borders to make sure we know who's coming in and out?
Well, I would think that certainly after 9/11, people should have been interested in it. We've always wondered why, when 9/11 occurred, that the first action of the president was not to close our borders, to secure the entire country, to find out who was here. That means airports, seaports, coastal waters, everything. Didn't happen. We think that needs to happen. There are too many people entering our country illegally right now about whom we know absolutely nothing. Now, how do we get people interested in this? Well, they better get interested, because the thousands arriving each day are an enormous burden on the states and local communities. I think that's beginning to have an effect in places like New York City and Chicago, where, frankly, they have no money. They have practically no means to billet people, to put them somewhere safe to live. And then, of course, you know, how do you employ people? We talk about this robust economy, but I think once you leave the bubble in Washington, most people don't see it. So I think we need to make clear that for all sorts of reasons, Americans should be interested. But again, let's be frank, Americans tend to not be interested until it affects them personally. So unless they're in an area where criminality is on the rise because of illegals that have come into the country, and they're suffering for it, or because it's costing them more money, we're probably going to have difficulty mobilizing public sentiment. But I think we're getting better. We're getting further. Right now, we need to see illegal border crossings the same way we see other forms of criminality in the United States. We know that 72% of surveyed Americans predict crime rates will increase this year. I mean, that's the perception. It's going to get worse. Well, if that's true, we already have a record high 56% of Americans who say crime is higher where they live than it's ever been, certainly since they remember it within the last few years. If that's true and they're paying any attention, they should be concerned. Now, how do you secure the place? I think that we're going to need military power. And I think OCOC would support that. Right now, our Border Patrol consists of overwhelmingly good people, but they're overwhelmed. There's been an enormous suicide outburst, if you will, or outbreak inside the Border Patrol, because these are good men and women who want to enforce the law, and this administration is not allowing them to do so. So at some point, it's going to be necessary to bring the Army in and set up a secure border to the south.
And Colonel, I just want to stay on this topic before we go to the next issue. I think you brought up suicides inside Border Patrol, but we're having record suicides of all Americans at this point. Yeah. I myself have lost 2 brothers to suicide based on drug use, and it's an important issue to me, and I know it is many Americans. And drug use is on, overdoses are on the rise at record highs. Crime in inner cities is at record highs. These are issues that Americans face every single day. Every state is a border state, and every state has crime, suicide, and overdoses. It's not just, hey, by the border, or hey, over here in this state or that state. It's everywhere. What does OCOC think about that?
Well, OCOC thinks that we had 100,000 deaths from fentanyl overdoses last year. If you go back to the last 5 years, you're talking almost 100,000 deaths every year just from fentanyl. Yep. Now, there are other drugs out there, and they kill people as well in smaller numbers. But stop and consider that. If we say 500,000 roughly over the last 5 years, more Americans have died in the last 5 years than died during the Second World War or the First World War. You'd have to go all the way back to the Civil War to find those kinds of losses. So we are in a war. We're in a war here at home to stop it, but we also know that it pours in through our borders. It comes in through seaports and airports, less airports now, but still through seaports. We have to regard this as a war. We have to treat the cartels as the enemy. Now, I'm not advocating, and I don't think anyone at OCOC is advocating going into Mexico or anywhere else or Colombia and waging war. That's not the point. We have to defend the border. We need to defend it with military power that poses the threat of violence against the drugs, against the drug cartels, against the criminals coming into our country. Until you make it clear that we have forces that will shoot to kill, this is not going to stop, frankly speaking.
And I'll say this too. I think you brought it up earlier, Colonel. These issues are bipartisan issues, right? I mean, it doesn't matter if you vote left, if you vote right, if you vote independent. Drugs are killing our youth. They're killing our middle age, and they're killing our elderly. They're killing. It doesn't matter who you vote for. And the same thing goes with election integrity. We want everybody to have a fair shot. If you run for office, you have a fair shot to win. You have a fair shot to lose. It goes both ways, which brings me to my final issue today.
Well, Mike, before you leave that point, you just made a very important statement, and you're correct. Politicians frequently pay lip service to all of this. True. But when it comes time to vote the right way or to put forward legislation that addresses these things, what do? They back down. Yep. They back down because of big donors to one side or the other that don't want the border secured. They're dealing with oligarchs, if you will, in our country, with enormous quantities of money who want the criminality to continue. This is an enormous problem. So OCOC wants to identify these people who are not representing our interests so that we can get them out of office, to be perfectly blunt, and find other people who will represent our interests. Anyhow, Sorry
Well,
about
no, you're exactly right. And the people that lose the most are the American people, right? You and I are the ones that lose the most on that. Final topic that I want to talk with you about: protecting our children. We see a lot of things, whether it be drug use, whether it be this push to transform people from male to female, whether it be the idea of sexualizing children at drag shows and different events. We're seeing it across the country. Again, not in one state, not in another state, everywhere. What are OCOC's thoughts on this push to sexualize children, first off, and then the push to transform children into something that they're not when they're born?
Well, OCOC thinks it's important for Americans to understand that it's not just a few government officials that we're dealing with who are radical leftists who are effectively pushing an agenda that is more than just revolutionary, it's degenerate, it's perverse. We're dealing with corporations now who, for reasons of profit motive and political favors, are also siding and aligning themselves with this radical agenda. We have the teachers union, which is very comfortable with all of these things, which is why we have a problem in the schools with education now in the public schools. So we need to understand that the schools are turning into laboratories of indoctrination. I think that's the biggest issue. And we don't want that to occur. We want that to stop. We think parents should educate and train their children, that parents should imprint their children. Parents should be the source of the values their children have and hold and implement. So that's the first thing. We need to also understand that, for instance, in the third grade, they are now teaching sex education classes. Well, I don't know what's happened, but what I can remember from the third grade is that, frankly, was not on my mind. So the real question is, why would we do such a thing? Why would we address something like that so early? Well, it's obvious. They're trying to imprint these children. They're trying to tell them something is right that is not, and encourage them to engage in behavior that is perverse, frankly. And of course, this is also a problem for the parents who object, because the parents are then actively threatened. They go to the school boards attack them, teachers attack them, and suddenly officials from the federal government, including the FBI, have showed up to intimidate people. This is a catastrophe. And the only way we can fix this is to go after these individuals on a state-by-state basis, as well as on the national level. We need to press for legislation. I mean, why would we allow children of a tender age, 6 and 7, to make decisions about changing their sexual identity, physically changing it on the operating table? That's insane. We think that should be criminalized. Any doctor that engages that should be subject to criminal prosecution. It's wrong. Why you would indulge this for anyone who is under the age of 18 is a mystery. Asking them to wait until they're 18 years of age is entirely reasonable. It's not going to end their lives by no means. In fact, they may well discover that all of this is indeed just a fad. For little children, they may think this is the same as receiving a tattoo. Well, if I don't like it in a few years, I can remove it. And we know that's not going to happen. Then, of course, this cannot be viewed in isolation from the human trafficking and the pedophilia, which is widespread, sadly, in so many countries, not only ours. But we know that we have a huge problem with children disappearing. Tens of thousands have disappeared in Ukraine. God only knows where those poor children have ended up. We don't even want to think about it. We've lost track of that sort of thing. We know that thousands of children are spirited away across the border. There has to be an end to this. This has to be systematically opposed. And remember, the former Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg was one of those who was advocating reduction in ages for the age of consent. So we're actually dealing with people on the left that want to make pedophilia, if you will, legal. This is unacceptable. But once again, where are the representatives? Oh, people pay lip service, but where are those people who are willing to stand up, be counted, and support the right kind of legislation and take on this LGBTQR or whatever agenda it happens to be? This has to end. Our children are the future.
This is one of the many issues that I agree with you. It takes a ground level, starting from the ground, going state to state, town to town, city to city, and talking through these things. And I think America's future depends on it, Colonel. And that's where I'm going to leave you today with this. How can people join the fight and get more information about Our Country, Our Choice?
Well, the first thing I would do is go to the website, go to ourcountryourchoice.com. There are plenty of instructions there. You can easily become a member. It costs nothing. And once you're in it, then you can look at the alternatives for you. What are your areas of interest? Where do you want to join the fight? Where do you want to make a difference? And that will be made clear on the website. And I think everyone will find something there that they can contribute to. We've talked about these three issues, which are burning issues for us right now. They're not the only ones. Mm-hmm. We're opposed to unending wars. We want to see the wholesale restoration of the rule of law. We want to see police back on the streets able to conduct their business and do their jobs instead of worrying about being sent to jail because a criminal has accused them of something, which is what we see in too many cities right now.
It's our country, as the name is, and it's our choice, and it's our duty, I think, to make sure that we continue to be the greatest country in the world. And I have faith in the American people. I have faith in America to always be the greatest, but you need to fight for it. And I think that's the biggest message. You need to fight for it, and you can't just hope that other people do. You have to get involved and do what you can. CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Mike.
Folks, join the fight. Keep fighting the good fight for America. OurCountryOurChoice.com. Thanks again for joining us.